announcing today a major show of military force in the region.
For 18 months, nothing happened. No explosions, no alerts, no breaking news. And that was exactly the point. Somewhere beneath the surface of a warm, crowded sea, Iranian submarines began to move. Quietly, patiently, according to plan. Their commanders believed they understood the rhythm of the US Navy. When it watched, when it relaxed, when it assumed nothing was there. They believed modern war still rewarded silence. That if you were unseen, you were untouchable. They were wrong. This is not a story about a battle. It's a story about an 8-minute collapse that no one on the surface noticed. The submarines did everything right. They avoided active sonar. They minimized transmissions. They hugged the seabed where civilian noise masked their presence. Battery usage was calculated down to the hour. Routes were chosen not for speed, but for ambiguity. On paper, it was flawless. What they didn't see was the other battlefield. Above them, no single sensor was tracking them. No dramatic ping echoed through the water. Instead, fragments appeared. A brief radio burst here, a deviation from shipping lanes there, an acoustic anomaly that didn't matter by itself, but mattered when combined with geography, timing, and behavior. To the crews below, nothing felt wrong. To the analysts above, the picture was already forming. The US Navy didn't move to intercept. It didn't accelerate ships or scramble aircraft in visible response. Instead, it waited. Because modern control isn't about reaction, it's about prediction. Each decision the submarines made narrowed their future. Each attempt to remain hidden reduced their options. Battery limits became boundaries. Geography became a cage. Silence became a liability. And then, without warning, the balance shifted. Helicopters appeared far from the submarines' estimated positions, deliberately so. Sonobuoys were dropped not to search, but to confirm what models already predicted. A single American submarine adjusted course, never revealing itself, quietly sealing off the last viable escape route. The Iranian crews felt it before they understood it. Systems demanded power. Air grew stale. Data flooded in faster than it could be processed. Every possible move carried risk. Staying deep meant running out of time. Moving meant being seen. The ocean itself had become hostile, not because it was loud, but because it was informed. When the submarine surfaced, there was no confrontation. No weapons locked. No warning shots. Just ships already waiting, already positioned, already calm. The operation was over, and had been for minutes. Nothing was destroyed. No one was harmed. Yet the outcome was absolute. Because the real loss wasn't metal or machinery. It was certainty, confidence. The belief that stealth alone grants freedom. This video is about how modern naval power works when no one is watching. How information replaces firepower. How control is exercised without escalation. And how, in today's oceans, the most dangerous moment is not when you are detected, but when you don't realize you already have been. Stay with us. This is the story of a battle that never happened, and why it changed everything. The operation began without orders being shouted or flags being raised. There was no dramatic departure, no public signal that anything unusual was happening. Iranian submarines slipped away from their bases the way they had dozens of times before, blending into routine patrol schedules that looked unremarkable even to trained observers. On paper, these movements could be explained as training, readiness drills, or regional presence missions. In reality, they marked the opening phase of a carefully staged attempt to test the limits of American awareness at sea. The submarines involved were diesel-electric boats, not designed for speed or endurance, but for patience. Their commanders understood that their strength lay in discretion. They moved slowly, often below 5 knots, keeping machinery loads low to reduce acoustic signatures. Crews were instructed to treat every sound as a potential liability. A dropped tool, an unnecessary valve adjustment, even raised voices. For days at a time, the boats operated in near total silence, communicating with command only through prearranged time windows, using extremely short, low-power transmissions that lasted seconds. The choice of operating area was deliberate. Busy sea lanes created a constant background of civilian noise. Container ships, tankers, fishing vessels, offshore platforms. This acoustic clutter made isolation difficult and created the illusion of anonymity. Iranian planners believed that within this environment, a quiet submarine could disappear, not because it was invisible, but because it was unremarkable. Historical data seem to support this assumption. In previous decades, similar submarines had successfully evaded detection by more powerful navies under comparable conditions. What made this deployment different was its intent. The goal was not to attack, but to observe. To see how close one could approach American naval formations without triggering a response. To map patrol rhythms, reaction times, and sensor patterns. To answer a question that had occupied planning rooms for years: how much freedom still existed beneath the surface? From the perspective of the crews, the first phase felt almost reassuring. Nothing challenged their expectations. No sonar contacts suggested pursuit. No aircraft lingered overhead. Surface traffic behaved normally. Each hour that passed without incident reinforced the belief that they were succeeding. Battery consumption matched projections. Environmental conditions were favorable. Even minor currents aligned with forecasts. The sea, it seemed, was cooperating. What they could not see was that the operation was already being noticed, not as a threat, but as a pattern. A deviation too subtle to trigger alarms, but consistent enough to be logged. An absence where presence was expected. A routine that repeated with slightly altered timing. None of it alarming, all of it interesting. American systems did not react in the way Iranian planners anticipated. There was no surge of activity, no visible tightening of defenses. That absence of response was interpreted as confirmation that the submarines remained undetected. In truth, it reflected something else entirely: confidence. Modern naval awareness did not require immediate action. It required continuity. As the submarines continued their slow advance, their commanders believed they were setting the conditions. In reality, the conditions were being set around them. Every course correction, every pause to conserve power, every decision to remain deep instead of rising to recharge contributed to a growing statistical picture. The operation had begun quietly, exactly as intended. The mistake was assuming that silence meant isolation. By the end of this initial phase, nothing had happened in any conventional sense. No confrontation, no signal, no acknowledgement. Yet the opening move was complete. The pieces were on the board, the trajectories established. From this point forward, the outcome would depend less on stealth and more on time. And time was already being measured by someone else. The second phase of the plan had been taking shape long before the submarines ever left port. For Iranian naval planners, this was not a spontaneous decision or a reaction to a single event, but the product of a doctrine that had been evolving for years under pressure, sanctions, and constant observation. Lacking the resources to compete symmetrically with a technologically superior navy, Iran focused instead on predictability, studying its opponent until patterns appeared where others saw randomness. Naval intelligence units spent months assembling open-source data, satellite imagery, commercial shipping records, and declassified exercise reports. Every public deployment of American carrier groups was logged, not just for where they went, but for how they moved. Transit speeds, preferred sea lanes, refueling intervals, and habitual standoff distances from coastlines were all cataloged. Over time, this information formed behavioral templates rather than fixed routes. The assumption was not that U.S. forces followed scripts, but that human and logistical constraints inevitably shaped their choices. Former submarine commanders were brought into planning rooms as consultants. Some of them retired for years, others reassigned from training commands. Their role was to translate raw data into lived experience. They debated how American crews thought under prolonged operations, when fatigue set in, and which precautions were relaxed first when nothing seemed to be happening. One recurring belief gained traction: that American anti-submarine warfare was at its most aggressive during transitions, arrivals, departures, exercises, and most relaxed during steady-state presence. It was within that perceived calm that opportunity was believed to exist. Training cycles were adjusted to reinforce this mindset. Submarine crews practiced extended low-activity patrols, learning to resist the psychological pressure to do something. Simulators emphasized discipline over initiative, rewarding crews that held position for hours rather than those that maneuvered creatively. Instructors stressed that the most dangerous mistake was impatience. Silence, they argued, was not passive. It was an active posture that forced the adversary to reveal itself first. At the same time, technical preparations were quietly refined. Acoustic profiles of Iranian submarines were updated using controlled trials, some conducted at night in restricted waters, others disguised as routine maintenance runs. Engineers experimented with minor modifications, new damping materials, altered maintenance schedules, changes in auxiliary system usage, to shave small but meaningful signatures from the boats. None of these changes were revolutionary, but together they reinforced the belief that the submarines were quieter than their American counterparts expected. Perhaps the most consequential preparation, however, was conceptual rather than technical. Iranian planners increasingly viewed submarine operations not as isolated missions, but as probes. Each deployment was meant to gather feedback, even if nothing obvious occurred. If a patrol ended without incident, it was treated as confirmation of invisibility. If subtle changes were observed, an aircraft altering altitude, a ship adjusting course, those were logged as signs of partial awareness. Over time, this feedback loop produced confidence that borders on certainty. What planners underestimated was how much of this preparation mirrored their opponent's own methods. While Iran studied routes and rhythms, the US Navy studied deviations and intent. While Iranian analysts searched for moments of relaxation, American systems were designed to function precisely when nothing dramatic happened. The very patience Iranian doctrine prized was assumed, even expected, by those on the other side. By the time the operation entered its active phase, Iranian leadership believed it had eliminated surprise from the equation. They were not trying to shock or overwhelm. They were trying to blend in so completely that presence itself became irrelevant. In internal assessments, the risk was rated as manageable, even low. The submarines, they believed, were not entering hostile space but shared space, an environment too complex and too crowded for total control. This confidence was sincere, and it was earned through methodical effort. Yet it rested on a critical assumption, that knowing an adversary's habits equated to understanding their awareness. The months of preparation produced clarity, but it was a clarity focused outward. What remained largely unexamined was how much of that preparation had already been observed, contextualized, and quietly incorporated into someone else's models. By the time the operation moved beyond observation and into intent, the strategic objectives had crystallized into something far more abstract than contact or confrontation. The aim was to create presence without consequence, to demonstrate that Iranian submarines could occupy contested maritime space while remaining functionally ungoverned. This was meant to be a message rather than an action, directed as much inward as outward. Domestically, it would validate years of investment in undersea forces. Regionally, it would suggest that deterrence no longer flowed in only one direction. Internationally, it would hint, subtly, that control of the sea was negotiable. That ambition, however, carried within it the seeds of miscalculation. Iranian planners assumed that strategic signaling at sea operated on visible cues: distance closed, weapons armed, escorts maneuvering. They believed that if none of these occurred, then the message was landing as intended. What they failed to account for was the possibility that the signal had already been received, decoded, and filed away without acknowledgement. The absence of response was interpreted as strategic ambiguity. In reality, it was administrative certainty. This disconnect became more pronounced as the submarines settled into their assigned operating patterns. The crews believed they were choosing positions of advantage, but those choices were constrained by factors they could not escape: depth contours, thermal layers, shipping density, and above all, endurance. Each of these constraints reduced the theoretical infinity of the ocean into a finite set of usable options. From the inside, the sea still felt vast. From the outside, it was becoming increasingly bounded. One of the central errors lay in how detection itself was understood. Iranian doctrine still treated detection as a binary event. Either a submarine was found, or it was not. Everything was organized around avoiding that moment. What was underestimated was the degree to which modern naval surveillance no longer required certainty to be effective. Partial data, when accumulated over time, did not need to prove presence. It needed only to eliminate alternatives. This distinction proved decisive. As the operation progressed, American forces did not pursue confirmation in the traditional sense. There was no attempt to force contact or compel reaction. Instead, the environment around the submarines was subtly reshaped. Patrol aircraft adjusted flight patterns not to search, but to normalize coverage in areas the models already favored. Surface ships altered spacing just enough to complicate approach vectors without signaling alarm. These changes were minor, almost bureaucratic in appearance, but their effect was cumulative. Each adjustment reduced the submarine's freedom without ever acknowledging their existence. From the perspective of the crews, the situation grew increasingly ambiguous. Nothing indicated they had been compromised, yet opportunities failed to materialize. Predicted windows closed early. Assumed gaps were never quite empty. Decisions that should have been neutral carried unexpected consequences. A course chosen for concealment led into unfavorable currents. A depth selected for acoustic advantage complicated sensor calibration. None of this was alarming on its own, but together it generated friction. Small delays, higher energy costs, marginally increased stress. Above the surface, analysis continued to refine itself. The U.S. Navy treated the unfolding situation as a live experiment rather than a threat, feeding real-world behavior into adaptive models. Each Iranian decision validated or corrected assumptions, tightening probability ranges. What had begun as a loose hypothesis became, over time, a constrained forecast. By the time American commanders began to act decisively, they were no longer asking where the submarines might be. They were confirming where they could no longer go. This approach turned time into a weapon. Battery limitations, once simply an engineering concern, became a strategic lever. The longer the submarines remained submerged, the fewer choices remained viable. Surfacing carried political risk. Repositioning increased exposure. Holding course consumed resources without improving position. The crews were not trapped in a physical sense, but they were being boxed in mathematically. Psychological pressure compounded the problem. Information flowed in uneven bursts, forcing rapid interpretation without context. Sensor contacts appeared and disappeared without explanation. Systems demanded attention simultaneously. The sense of operating freely gave way to a growing awareness that the environment was reacting, not aggressively, but intelligently. This realization, once it set in, was difficult to dismiss. Training emphasized discipline, but discipline could not eliminate doubt. Crucially, American forces never needed to force a decision. By controlling the risk landscape, they ensured that any choice the submarines made would favor containment over initiative. The moment of collapse was not marked by detection, but by convergence. When multiple constraints aligned, energy state, positional uncertainty, environmental conditions, the operation's strategic goals quietly inverted. Maintaining presence now required exposure. Preserving safety required withdrawal. Neither option delivered the message the planners had intended. When the situation resolved itself, it did so without spectacle. There was no declaration of success or failure. No escalation, no engagement. The submarines remained intact, their crews unharmed. Yet the outcome was unmistakable to those who understood it. A capability had been tested and found conditionally effective. Stealth still mattered, but it no longer guaranteed autonomy. Presence without acknowledgement proved to be a liability rather than an advantage. The lesson extended beyond the immediate actors. For the U.S. Navy, the episode reaffirmed a doctrine centered on information dominance and restraint. For Iran, it forced a reassessment not of technology, but of assumptions. The sea had not rejected them. It had simply revealed, with quiet precision, who was setting the terms. What emerged from this convergence of goals, errors, and control was not a confrontation, but a recalibration. The operation demonstrated that modern naval power no longer needs to announce itself to be decisive. It only needs to be patient enough to let the opponent move first, and informed enough to ensure that every move brings the end closer.